Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode of Extrology. Today we've a guest who truly believes that the best things in life come from conversations. Conversations that are sometimes powerful, sometimes awkward, but always transformative. Meet Tom Schwab. With a background as a Navy veteran and nuclear propulsion plant operator, Tom isn't your typical marketing guru. Described as tough-minded and always asking what if by the head of the nuclear navy, Tom brings a unique and skeptical lens to digital marketing. As a small business owner, he's been a pioneer in the inbound marketing space, focusing especially on leveraging targeted podcast interviews to create genuine connections. He's also the author of 2 game-changing books, Podcast Guest Profits, which has been called the Bible of podcast guesting, and One Conversation Away, a manifesto for building a rich life and a profitable business. So buckle up, folks. This conversation is set to challenge your preconceptions and inspire your journey. What's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Tom Schwab, welcome to Extrology. It's great to have you here as my guest today. How you doing? You look great. How's life treating you well?
Life is good. There's a lot of problems in the world, but there's no better time to be alive. And I'm excited to be talking with you here across the pond.
Fantastic. Well, look, let's dive straight in. And I wondered if, Tom, you might kick us off by sharing why you think digital marketing might actually be hurting businesses.
Well, I think there's this overarching noise now, right? And we're interrupting people. We're yelling at people. And this idea that we can take what works selling a $5 product and use that in selling a relationship service or a higher ticket item or a business to business, right? I cringe every time I hear that phrase. Oh, you're just one funnel away, right? Well, if funnels work so well, why isn't Boeing and Airbus selling their aircraft with funnels and Facebook ads, right? It's a totally different sale. And I think if you have a relationship sale, if you have a higher ticket B2B sale or B2C sale, if you try to use that same tactics for people that are using, $10 products, it's not going to work. It's actually going to work against you. And I've got to say that this idea didn't originate in my mind. It came from a client. And he came to me and I asked him, why do you want to do podcast interviews? And he said, because I think the vast majority of digital marketing is like the digital equivalent of advertising above a urinal. And I was like, you got to explain this to me. And he's like, if people saw me on a TikTok dance, if they saw me on a bus or a park bench or above a urinal, he said it would hurt my business, not help it. And really, that's where I'm looking at, is there's difference. We're not one funnel away. We're one conversation away.
I was going to ask, and you've alluded to it, what led you to challenge the conventional wisdom about digital marketing tools? But that's where the conversation was stimulated, or the thought process was stimulated. Was it by that particular client?
I think it was that he put words to it and a visual that I will never forget. But even as I look at other things in my life, right? This idea of, the funnel, you're one funnel away. As I look at the best thing that's ever happened in my life, it did not come through a funnel. It came through a conversation, right? You think about your best customers, your best partners, your best employees, right? It's not all through a funnel, right? My bride, she came through a conversation and an introduction from a friend. It's not like I built this perfect funnel, had 7 billion come through it, and my bride came out of it. No, it's conversations. Meaningful things come from conversations.
And actually, you make the reality is of that point, something that we've been doing for tens of thousands of years, right? ever since the concept of language has evolved. But nonetheless, we've been having conversation, whether that be sat around campfires or sat on podcasts opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Those conversations have stimulated so much of what society and humanity is about.
Yes, because the more advanced we get, I think the more connection we want too. I heard somebody the other day talk about the kiss of death right now is for somebody to think you're AI, right? If you send somebody an email and they're like, oh, that's AI, or you send somebody a resume or a letter like that, it's the quickest way to get ignored is if they think you're not a person. So I think there's a need for human connection. And, now with the digital age, we can do that at scale, but we still have to remember that it is a conversation.
I think you make a really pertinent point, not least that sense that arguably we've never been more connected than from a global perspective. I remember I'm struck by a conversation I had with my nephew, who's a wonderful young man, 28 years old now. So, but nonetheless, what he would have been maybe 10 years ago, I think he made reference to something. He made a bold boast to me as to how many Facebook friends he had. So it was something like, I've got 800 Facebook friends. And I said, you don't even know 800 people. And I wasn't trying to do him down, but his point was, well, I've got all these wonderful people. How many? And I think there is some research somewhere nonetheless, which I'm just about to butcher, but I'm sure it's something like, is it 110, 120 people or something like that is the maximum number of meaningful connections?
I was thinking it was like 120, something around there.
Right.
And there's like, once the community gets bigger than that, it starts to split off.
Yeah.
And, it's the idea of, well, I've got, 10,000 friends on Facebook. No, you don't. Half of them are bots. And, to me, a friend is if I can call them in the middle of the night and say, Lee, my car broke down. And they say, I'll be there in 20 minutes. That's a friend, right? And that has value, not just random connections. It's almost like when people are optimizing in digital marketing for, we want more likes, we want more follows, we want more leads. It's like none of those things show up on the balance sheet, right? The bank is not interested in how many leads you have. They want to know how many great customers that you have, that you provide value to them, that they value what you do, because those are called profits when it runs through.
Absolutely. Again, I'm struck by a conversation that took place many moons ago, probably best part of 20 years. I was one of the first, I used to have this badge of honor on LinkedIn. I was one of the first 1 million users of LinkedIn. So I used to have this first 1 million badge. And I remember a conversation with a very smart business professor that I knew as part of a panel I was involved with. And he made a bold boast one day as to how many LinkedIn connections he had, and it was north of 10,000. And at the time I had less than 1,000. And I said, interesting, why 10,000? You can't possibly have met 10,000 people through the course of your working life. I mean, really met, rather than just people you've brushed past in a corridor. And he went, no, but I've done this research, Lee, and the magic number is 10,000 connections. And once I did the research, and once I got to 10,000 connections, opportunities started to present. I thought, okay. So I went out and I thought, I'm going to test this theory. And I went out and I literally kind of spammed LinkedIn, like, who wants to connect with me? The upshot to which was I ended up with about 15,000 connections. About 10 years after that, I culled every single one of those 15,000 connections and then made a point, and that 10,000 went down to about 15,000 went down to about 3,000. To the extent now where I will only connect with people I genuinely have had a conversation with, have shaken a hand with, whether that be virtually in this sort of scenario but somebody I have actually met, and that therefore I can develop some sort of relationship with, to their benefit, to our mutual benefit. But I think we hadn't gotten to this point, didn't it? It's all become about the numbers. It's all become about reach and numbers, which you're espousing the virtues of the value in the relationship itself as being really where the magic happens.
Yeah. And, we work with so many different clients, and I learned so much from them. There was one lady, she's actually now the CMO of LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And I love what Gail Moody Bird says, that we're getting more efficient at things that are less effective. Right? So how efficient is, you could have taken that from 15,000 to 30,000 LinkedIn connections if you had just used a bot or, some hack, right? It's very efficient to do it, but would it be effective, right? Would it actually drive any connection or any meaningful change in your life? No. It's almost like the little time we've talked to each other right here. Both of us could have sent 1 million emails in this time, right? It would be very efficient, but I don't think it'd be very effective.
No, you mentioned the idea of obscurity, every business's biggest problem. As I understand it, that's a phrase that I can attribute to you, or certainly a phrase that you will have uttered. Can you unpack that a bit for me?
Yeah, and I really believe whether or not you're at version 1.0 or 20.0, there's somebody that your product or service is perfect for, right? There's somebody on their knees praying for what you have to offer. And the reason they're not engaging with you is because they don't know you exist, right? We don't buy the best. We buy the best we know of. And, 50 years ago, your customers were within 10 miles of driving to you, right? I can remember my grandfather, right? Cunningham Service Station, right? If you weren't within 10 miles of him, you weren't a customer. Now, fast forward here, you've got customers around the world, right? Depending what you do, you've got this glut of potential customers. And I believe you shouldn't even be talking or marketing to those people that aren't even, aware of it, right? I love how Rand Fishkin, who started a company called SEO Moz and wrote a great book called Lost and Founder. He said the best way to sell something today is not to sell anything, but to earn the respect, awareness, and trust of those ready to buy, right? Nobody wants to be sold. But if you give them, hey, here's how I can solve the problem, you don't have to worry about the sales process. The marketing will be so good, it will attract the right people. And so that's why I really believe obscurity is the biggest problem. And we need to get heard, not by everyone, but by our ideal customers, our super consumers.
And do you think, therefore, that businesses are perhaps too focused on tools and tactics rather than the actual fuel, if you like, which is the conversations?
Oh, very much so. And I'm an engineer by degree, and I fall into this trap at time, right? And it's like, oh, this new tool is great. This is great. What I have to keep reminding myself is that tools are just amplifiers, right? They can either be amplifiers of your brilliance or your stupidity, right? And I was reminded of this a couple winters ago, right? I had a chainsaw, and I had just seen a friend of mine, Dan Miller. He had an artist come and carve this beautiful eagle out of a dead tree, right? The thing is amazing. And the artist used a chainsaw, and it amplified his creativity and brilliance. Well, that winter, I'm out cutting some firewood, and I almost slipped and cut my leg off, right? By the grace of God, I was okay. But I'm like, it's the same tool, right? It just amplified brilliance or stupidity. And I think it's the same way now with these digital tools, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And if you've got something to say, if you've got brilliance there, it's a great way to amplify that. But just being heard by more people, if you don't have something to say or you don't have that brilliance, what was it? There's a quote in the United States, I think, that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln that says, better to be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. And I think sometimes the tools allow us to remove all doubt.
So I've read and heard you coin the phrase other people's platforms, OPP,
yes,
as more valuable than other people's money, OPM. How did you arrive at that conclusion?
First of all, I changed it from OPP to OPA for other people's audience because I showed my age there when somebody came and said, have you ever heard the song OPP? And I'm like, oh.
I just naughty by nature, saying I'm showing my age there now, but referencing that.
Well, somebody had to point it out to me, but I really believe that other people's audience is more valuable than other people's money, right? And there's a big thing like in real estate, you'll hear, oh, use other people's money and leverage and all the rest of this. And I first made that claim that other people's audiences are more valuable than other people's money back when interest rates were a fraction of what they are. But I don't care if interest rates double and double again, that statement is still true. And let me give you an example, right? Now I'm showing my age again. Oprah, right? If Oprah came to me and said, I want to give you $1 million, right? Lee, I love what you're doing. I want to loan you $1 million, right? Or I want to give you $1 million, right? I want to support your cause there. Well, you take it, right? But if she said, I'll give you $1 million, or if you want, you can just be on my show for, 45 minutes. Which one are you going to choose?
I choose the show every time.
The show. And, Sarah Blakely, who's the founder of a company in the U.S. called Spanx, that's how she launched her entire business. She could go to the bank and get money, but once she got on Oprah's platform there, she got the authority. She got the transfer of authority from Oprah. She got that exposure. So that idea of you can leverage money, okay, everybody can do that. But if you can leverage somebody else's audience, that will take you to new levels there. And I think too often we forget that the best people have done that, right? And it's nothing new, right? Whether it's a podcast interview, whether it's going on television, you think of back in the days when you'd run an advertisement on a newspaper. Well, you didn't have to run an advertisement. You could have just started your own newspaper and built that up there. You don't have to be a guest on somebody's physical stage, right? You could have started your own physical stage and been as big as Tony Robbins, right? Or you could get invited on Tony Robbins' stage. So to me, it's sort of the easy way, the faster way, the more fun way to tap into somebody else's existing audience.
I guess it's no different in many. It's that third party endorsement, isn't it? It's no different in many ways to Nike persuading Michael Jordan to wear their shoe over Adidas and Converse back in the day.
Yes.
You're then utilizing Michael Jordan's audience, if you like, to enhance your product. It's in a similar way. You go on Oprah's platform. It's like Oprah's saying, "I endorse this. I'm letting him on. I recognize the value that this person can attribute. You, as my trusted audience, should do too." It's almost like it's almost the unwritten rule of third-party endorsement.
It is, and it's that idea of not just trying to break through the noise, but to get in on the conversation that people are listening to. So, nobody started this podcast to listen to it because it's like, oh, I follow Tom Schwab on all his podcasts. No, they're here to listen to you, Lee, and the guests that you bring on. So there's that instant credibility. So instead of trying to yell at somebody to get them to listen to you, why not just get in on the conversation that they're already choosing to listen to, that they're already subscribing to, that they're already going to?
The thing that strikes me as to and arguably I have a vested interest in persuading anybody as to a certain point of view, but if you like, the value and virtue that I see in podcasting is as a bit of a kickback against, and I appreciate podcasting's been around longer than Twitter, but if you look at the original premise of Twitter, that kind of, we condensed life into 140 characters. I know it's become a lot more since, but initially the basic premise, and as I understand it, the reason for 140 characters was at the time, I think that was the maximum number of characters that you could fit into an SMS. I think that's originally where the idea came from. So we tried to condense conversation to 140 characters. And almost it became as a rub against that, a pushback against that. It's like, no, people genuinely want meaningful, long-form conversation to participate in, to hear, to listen. I don't know if that's, I've got no evidence to back that view, but my sense is that's part of what, and I think you also make reference to podcasting as 25x more effective than blog posts. Now, as a former blogger, I love to write. I've seen value in both, but I guess what's your perspective on why perhaps you feel podcast interviews are 25 times more effective than blogs?
I think your point there is that, people consume information in different ways, right? Some people are readers. Some people like to listen to the podcast. Some people like to watch the videos, right? So we live in a great time where we can take that content and repurpose it, right? So you could take a podcast interview, you could repurpose that into a blog. Now, I've written a lot of blogs in my life, but every one of them felt like a homework assignment. So for me, talking is much easier and then repurposing it. But early on, this had to be about 2016, we did some testing, and a good blog will convert 1% to 2%, meaning if you get 100 people that read your blog or visit the blog, 1% to 2% of them will click on the lead and, give you their address and everything like that. That's a good conversion rate. So we started to use podcast interviews and then send them to a page to get the offer. And we were seeing conversion rates once they got to the page there of 25, 50, even 75%. And at first I'm like, this is too good to be true, right? But the more I thought about it, it's like, well, no, why wouldn't it, right? Because if somebody just goes to your blog and just sort of hits on it, they may read it, they may skim it. There's not a big investment of time, right? But if somebody listens to you for 30 or 45 minutes on a podcast interview, they're either going to turn you up or turn you off. Either one is fine, right? If they're not a great customer, that's fine. Let them go on with their life. But if they resonated with something that you said, why wouldn't you expect them to go to your site and take that offer and connect with you? So from that standpoint, we started to just work on how can you make that easier for them to cut down on that friction. Because I believe, people talk about magnetic marketing, right? Draw all these people to you. Well, that's not how a magnet works, right? A magnet attracts, but it also repels. And I think the best marketing does that, right? It attracts the people that value what you do, that are ideal clients, and it repels the other. And not that they're bad or you're bad, it's just not a good fit. So I think the better the marketing, the easier the sales. And that's why we see with leads that come through podcast interviews, they close faster, they close for a higher level. There's less churn rate on it, really because of the marketing was such at the very beginning that they knew exactly who you were and why they wanted to work with you.
Do you recall the first podcast you listened to, or perhaps, if not, what turned you on to podcasting in the first place?
I was introduced to it by my, at that time, girlfriend, right? She had an iPod and she started to listen to podcasts. And the first one I listened to was Internet Business Mastery. And later on, I got to meet one of the hosts, and it was like meeting a celebrity. But back in those days, and this was probably, probably 2007 maybe, listening to a podcast meant plugging it into the computer, downloading it, and then probably, I don't know how many songs the original iPod could hold. But I can remember running with it or mowing the lawn. And I just thought it was the neatest thing that I could listen to it when I wanted, where I wanted. And it seemed like it opened up the entire world, right? Of different ideas. And like I said, I'm more of a audible learner as opposed to a reader. And so to me, it was just like continually learning all the time. And I didn't have to put in cassette tapes into the car or CDs.
Do you, or can you share some success stories? Can you think of some success stories of brands or indeed individuals that have used targeted podcast interviews to connect, and what springs to mind?
Oh, very much so. And it's really, we've worked with high-level coaches, consultants, brands, right? I remember talking with one company that was B2B, right? And they had a monthly recurring revenue. They were focused on small business. And we talked to the chief marketing officer, and he's like, this makes sense. And then we presented it to the CEO. And Lee, it was the quickest sales conversation I ever had. We go through there, and the CEO stops and he goes, so you're telling me that you're going to get me in front of at least 1,000 ideal customers in that first 30 days. And I said, yeah, at least. And then, whatever happens over long term. And with their pricing model and everything like that, he comes back and he's like, and you're telling me that I just have to convert 2 people out of those 1,000 for this to pay for itself in the first 30 days. And I'm like, yep. And he asked the CMO, he's like, what other marketing channel do we have that pays for itself in the first 30 days? And the CMO's like, none. And I loved how the guy said, he's like, if we can't make this work, he says, don't fire Interview Valet, fire me as the CEO, because either the market hates our product or I can't pitch it well, right? So there's more of a big brand. I can think of a high-level consultant. He was a CPA, an accountant, a tax advisor. And he came to us and he said, I was almost wiped out in the last recession because everybody was brick and mortar where I lived. And he says, I want to diversify. In the United States, I want 50 different clients in 50 different states in 50 different industries. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess we just throw darts at the dartboard. Well, because we measure everything, about 3 months in, we were able to come back and say, you did amazing on this podcast with dentists. And he's like, yeah, I've already signed up one person from that, and I'll check, but I think I've got a few more calls scheduled with that. So let's do more dental podcasts. So Lee, for the next 5 months, all he did was dental podcasts. It was like fish in a barrel for him. And today, I still keep in touch with him. He's got 80% of his clients are dentists, right? He's even got a dental podcast where he talks about the business side of dentistry. And so it's that idea of you can get the market feedback. You can talk to your ideal customers. He never would have gotten that market feedback had he not done podcast interview marketing, right? Just not going out on random podcasts, but actually looking at the data. And, then there's other nonprofits we've worked with. And it's just amazing to me that they've got this great, this extraordinary message that could help them, could help the world. It's just nobody hears about it. And, the idea of just breaking through the noise isn't working. And then you get them out there and they're heard by the right people and the magic happens with that.
So where did the idea for Podcast Valet stem from?
I wish I could say that it was genius, right? Everything to my mind is evolutionary, not revolutionary. So my last business was HubSpot's first e-commerce case study. And we built up the entire thing through guest blogging, right? Built it up, sold it off. And about 2014, I was in a mastermind group during my sabbatical phase. And some people said, well, how did you do this? And I'm like, well, with guest blogging, but blogs by 2014 really weren't working that well. So I just hypothesized, I bet you could use podcast interviews almost like we used guest blogging. So we tested it for a while. It worked well. I wrote a cheesy little PDF on it and gave it to people. And somebody's like, oh, you should do a course. So I did a course, and Lee, I never took it out of beta because I could see that people weren't getting results with it. And the people that were honest during that 4-month beta run just said, listen, I don't want to learn how to do this, right? I just want to be the guest. You take care of all the rest. And I'm like, oh, that's good copy. I'm taking that. So we actually got the name Interview Valet from one of the beta testers. He's like, here's a great name for it. This is what you should use, and you should launch this. So in 2016, we launched it. And, in hindsight, people go, that was genius. At the time, I thought, oh, this is either really smart or really stupid, because I'd give my little elevator pitch and people would go, what's a podcast? Right. And so from about 2016 to about 19, it gave us the chance to build the systems, build the processes, build the relationships with the podcasters. And then in 2019, it really took off. We've always been a remote team intentionally. So when COVID hit, that was our finest hour. And, now we've grown to have a team of 32 in Europe and North America. So I would have to say it was just sort of, I stumbled into the next thing and just wondered, hey, I wonder what we used to use, how we could use it with the new technology.
It's a fascinating, I mean, obviously, again, vested interest. You're preaching to the converted because I love the media, but it struck me that as you're speaking now, I'm reflecting back on when actually did I first start listening to podcasts? And I reflect back to even in my late teen. I mean, I love music, so I've always had noise in the background whenever I was doing anything, even studying as a kid. I always had the radio on, always had music playing cassettes, whatever it would have been. But even as I grew up, I used to, as a single man, oftentimes I would go to bed with talk radio. So I've always had this sense of kind of background noise that I'd loved. But I think it was probably for me, James Altucher, Tim Ferriss. These are the people that spring to mind as you're talking about that podcasting journey. I suspect it was, for me, maybe 10. It sort of feels maybe 10-ish years ago that I started to really tune into it. But to your point, kind of 2016, people were still saying, what's a podcast? You look at it now, you look at the growth, and that growth is not slowing down as I understand it. If you look at the numbers, the proliferation of podcasting, it's only going in, at the moment, in one direction. And I think it's the authenticity of conversation. I think we touched on AI just slightly earlier on. It's the authenticity of the conversation that I think people really tap into.
I agree with you on that. And it's when you said Tim Ferriss, I had to chuckle. Tim Ferriss talks about how he got it started in his podcasting, right? He did a book tour for this book called The 4-Hour Workweek. And
which I think is the best book title that best describes what actually isn't the objective of the book ever written. If you wanted to sell copy, 4-hour work week, everybody wants that, right?
And, he saw it too, because he's like, how do I sell this book? And he tapped into other people's audience. So he's like one of the first ones I point to that did a podcast book tour. He was out there talking about his book at different places, and he got to see the hosts, how they did it. And at that point, he was like, this is fun. Right? I'm going to start my own podcast. So he went from being a guest to being a host, and the world is better for it.
Absolutely. Well, I think you say the best things in life come from conversations, which I absolutely endorse, even awkward ones, I think, as you preface that. And can you share from your own experience, perhaps, where a challenging conversation led to unexpected growth for you?
Very much so. And you'll hear me say a lot that peace and clarity come at the other side of an awkward 10-minute conversation. And I say it so often because I'm trying to remind myself of that. And the idea that nobody likes an awkward conversation. I guess there's some people that do, right? The vast majority of people don't like conflict. And so they would rather stay in ambiguity than they would having a tough conversation, right? So that pushing through, and if you don't understand something, asking the question, right? And I would say one of the best lessons I had on this was my, at that time, girlfriend, right? And Karen, I love her dearly. She didn't know where the relationship was going. And I am pretty much ADD as anything. And trying to get me to actually sit down and talk about this was really, really hard. So she went out and she got a cup of coffee and she got my favorite bagel. Came home, she sat it down and said, could we talk for just 5 minutes? Sure, right? I'm eating, I got my coffee, we can talk. I didn't know where we were going with it. And she broached the subject, like, where are we here? Where are we going with it? And that had to be an incredibly awkward and potentially devastating conversation, right? Better to live in, I don't know, maybe. But it allowed us to both get some peace and clarity on that. And I think that's so important, not just to have more chit-chat, but let's have meaningful conversations and ask those hard questions, not in judgment, but just because if we both understand where we are, we can move on from here. But if we're all both thinking what the other person would say, it's not going to work out. So more and more in my life, I've tried to have those real conversations, the difficult conversations, the non-judgmental conversations, but coming at it from more of just purely a curiosity of making sure that I've got that clarity around it, because once I get that clarity, right or wrong, I'll have peace with it too.
Do you think, I think you make a really interesting point. Do you think the art of the awkward conversation, the courage to have the awkward conversation, is diminishing? And the reason I ask that question is that I'm struck by our political landscapes on both sides of the pond. It's definitely the case here, and you have to, the sense that we're given from a perhaps social media perspective, admittedly, and that's not my experience of the larger population. But if I look at the social media angle, you have to be in a camp, right? So you have to either, for example, you have to be Biden or Trump. From a UK perspective, Brexit, you have to be yes or no. You can't be, well, there's elements of both sides. I like a little bit over here and I like a little bit over here. That reasoned debate was arguably, when I was being brought up, that was how you learned. So you try and take both sides, you try and listen reasonably to both sides of an argument, all sides of an argument, and then you inform your decision, take the bits you liked, and then form your own view. I wonder if it's my experience of the population at large is that is still an art that exists, but we might be led to believe by much of what we see that we have this really polarized, utterly polarized world. So I wondered if is the art of the awkward conversation a dying art? If it is, sadly, that horrifies me, but I wonder as to your experience.
As you said that, I would say the art of conversation is dying, not just awkward, right? From the standpoint, in the past, a great compliment could be, wow, Lee, you are an amazing conversationalist, right? If someone was a great conversationalist, you'd want to have them at dinner parties. You'd want to have them at your events, right? Because what did that mean? That they were interesting. They sparked conversation, right? They sparked ideas, right? And that's really what it's supposed to be. We've gone from you're a great conversationalist to I'm a better debater than you are, right?
Yeah,
and
that's a really interesting perspective.
That I can win the argument. And I love one of our clients, Bix Bixen. He's out of Vancouver, Canada. He's a futurist. And I love how he says, if you haven't changed your mind lately, how do you know you still have one? And so the idea now is people are, they're coming in with their idea, right? Not to learn anything, but to regurgitate what they have heard or solidify what they believe. And I think that's one of the blessings of podcasts and also one of the curses of podcasts, right? Because the blessing is that I can listen to anyone, that I can listen to new ideas, I can be educated, I can break down cultural and racial things because I can understand them, right? The flip side of that coin is I can choose the podcasts I listen to.
Yeah.
And I can choose the networks and the voices that I hear. So they tell me just what I want to hear and just what is right in my world.
You end up with confirmation bias becomes a huge, huge problem, right?
Huge echo chamber.
Yeah.
And even in the U.S., in the States here, right? For me, a pox upon them, both sides, right? And our local news here, I don't want to listen to it. And when I say local, I'd say national. I have more fun listening to the BBC, right? Because at least it's an outside perspective of what's going on in the world, right? And the BBC often will talk about colonial places that were important in the British Empire that never get mentioned in the United States, right? But it's a different viewpoint on it. So often I'll just try intentionally listening to different podcasts, and I have an opportunity to do that because I listen to every one of our clients' first interviews in order just to give them feedback and, to learn more about them. And so it's like Russian roulette of what I'm going to listen to. I could listen to a podcast about branding from a corporate level. I could listen to a podcast, we focus on health, nutrition, and wellness. I remember listening to one about menopause That's not something that I would normally listen to, but it gives me a new ideas, a new appreciation for different things. And I often will just tell people, just do Russian roulette, right? Pick a podcast, listen to it. Doesn't mean you'll agree with everything, but I guarantee you'll learn more from listening to a podcast that has a viewpoint you don't agree with than one that you do agree with.
Let's touch on a little bit as to your own background, Tom. You're a Navy veteran and a former nuclear propulsion plant operator. How do you think that shaped your approach to marketing and business?
Well, it's interesting. I've noticed that you can tell people where they started by how they think, right? Engineers think like engineers. Architects think like architects. Accountants think like accountants. And I think while I was never a good engineer, it was sort of that square peg in a round hole. That's what was offered at the U.S. Naval Academy. And so it taught me how to think and through processes. And I loved that portion of it. And then in nuclear power, it was so much of a cultural thing and a systems thing, right? You think about it right now, as we're speaking here, there's early 20-somethings, like the average age of someone running a nuclear power plant in the U.S. Navy is 21. And they're high school educated, right? They're highly educated, right? They put them through training. They're smart people, and there's great culture. But that showed me that you can systematize and teach just about anything, right? If the Navy had to run with PhDs in nuclear physics, they wouldn't have that many ships, right? And so when people tell me, oh, you don't understand my business, it's too complicated. I'm like, if they can teach nuclear power, you can teach your business. It's that you don't understand it. So with that, I've always looked at it as there's systems, there's processes. And the other thing too that it taught me is that don't blame the people, blame the systems and the processes, right? 98% of the world wants to do a great job, right? There's a couple percent that maybe are psychopaths, right? And I think as adults, as parents, as business owners, as whatever it is, often we blame the individual when we should look at it and say, were they just trying to do the best they did with the information they had, right? Did you set them up for failure? And if there was a problem, that's fine. Let's learn from it, right? Stupidity is doing the same thing over and over, right? So we've been doing Interview Valet for 9 years now. I cringe when I think back of the service we were offering people 8 years ago or 9 years ago, right? It was more podcast guessing than podcast interview marketing. But along the way, we're always getting better and improving with that. So I think that's really, as an engineer and through nuclear power, that shaped my life and has shaped the business and how we deliver it to our clients.
I think it's a really interesting perspective on marketing that what we've talked about here, systemization, process, but ultimately people and conversation. You combine those things, that becomes a really compelling proposition, right? A really powerful platform.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what you're optimizing for, right? What is the ultimate goal? And now in marketing especially, I see people are optimizing for things that they don't want, right? So, it used to be Facebook likes. Oh, I've got so many Facebook likes. Well, why? Oh, because I need more business. Well, there's no correlation between Facebook likes and business. Or now it seems like every email that I get is, do you want more leads? No, right? More leads does not mean more profits. And I remember a client come to us. He didn't end up working with us, but he came to us and he said, well, I need next year 5,000 leads from podcast interviews. And this guy's like a high-level coach. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot. Why do you need that? And he's like, well, because I need 5 new clients. And last year I did Facebook advertising or something. And I got 1,000 leads from it. And I got 1 customer. And I'm like, you don't need more leads, right? You need a better marketing system, right? So what are we optimizing for? And, at the end of the day, I always say the business hasn't changed. We're optimizing for value, right? And truly capitalistic things, you'd say businesses are optimizing for profit. Well, that's true, but how do you get profit, right? By giving the customer value, for them seeing the value that you give, that they value it so much that they would rather give you the money than hold on to it, because that's what they want, the results. So with that, it's like, from an engineering standpoint, yeah, what are we optimizing for? We can get whatever we want, but make sure it's the right thing.
You mentioned that the future is rich audio, not outdated video.
Mm-hmm.
What trends do you see that support that idea?
I have to give credit to where I heard this from. There's a futurist out of Stanford, Johansson. He wrote a book called The New Leadership Literacies. And I can remember listening to his book, and he talked about this. The future is vivid audio, not vivid video. And at first I thought I heard it wrong. I hit rewind.
I would have felt the same thing. I would have felt the same way when I read it, respectfully. I thought, how do I feel about that? I would have shared a similar view.
Exactly. And so I rewound it a couple times, and I'm like, wow, they didn't catch that in the edit. And then I started listening to it. And he was so right here, because video, while it's rich and it's engaging, it's also discriminating, right? So if we watch a video, we're looking at somebody and saying, well, you know what? They're too young. They're too old. They don't look like me. And often we stop listening, right? Flip side too, right? If you're watching something and the video has huge lapels, right? And they're so out of fashion, you're going to look at that and say, that's not timely here. Even now, you look back at sometimes old television, and it looks comical, right? Because of the video, the style, the fashions, whatever it was. But yet you go back to old audio and it sounds still current, right? There's still ideas that you can go in there. And this was really hit me when my niece was studying for a professional license, and they had told her to listen to Zig Ziglar. And I don't know if you remember Zig Ziglar, but she calls me up and she's like, Uncle Tom, have you ever heard of Zig Ziglar? And I'm like, yeah, honey. And she's like, well, I'm listening to these audiobooks or whatever, and he's great. And I figured you would like him. I didn't have the guts to tell her, honey, Zig has been dead for over a decade, right? And that was probably recorded before you were even born. Right. And if she would have seen him with his slicked back hair and his wide lapels and all the rest of that, she wouldn't have listened to anything. But because she was just listening to the words, she was judging him almost by the content of his character, the content of the content, not how he looked. So when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, there is a power to audio. And I agree with that. The audio is going to be the future. That's going to be the powerful thing, not just the video.
I think you make a really, really insightful point that I hadn't given an awful lot of consideration to. But actually, as you're talking there, I'm referencing my own journey down the YouTube rabbit hole, for example, that I might attribute certain production qualities might influence my view of a particular of content. All of it, there are all sorts of non-audio related cues that I'm picking up that are informing my choices and my decisions around what I think of the production in front of me. And yet you're absolutely right, and thank you, because you've given me a really interesting perspective I hadn't considered before. But when I'm listening, all I'm doing is listening, and I'm listening intently. I'm not making necessarily knee-jerk judgments around the content I'm acquiring. I'm really intently listening and making informed choices about how I feel about what I'm hearing, and that's a totally different experience that I'd never thought of before.
And it's nothing negative. It's just it's just the way humans are. We make snap decisions, right? That's how we survive throughout time, right? Do they look like me? Does this look like it could be timely, or does it look like it's dated? Whereas if we strip all that away and just look at the ideas, listen to the ideas, I think it's much, much more powerful.
Well, I'm reminded of a conversation I had from my day job as a recruiter. I remember a conversation with a wonderful chap who'd done an awful lot of work around unconscious bias. And this was in the context of hiring decisions. And I remember saying to him, well, I pride myself on, I look at the strengths of the individual and the talents of the individual and what it is that they're bringing to the hiring process and therefore potentially to the role. I'm not interested in where they came from and their gender or their ethnicity or their religious beliefs or any of those things. That doesn't bother me. I'm really interested in their talent. He said, that's really interesting, Lee. Good for you. Wonderful. How many times have you got on the tube subway for US guests? How many times have you got on the tube late at night, got in a carriage, seen someone at the other end of the carriage that you didn't like the look of? Maybe it was the way they were dressed, maybe it was the colour of the hair, but you just felt uncomfortable about being around them. And as a consequence of that lack of comfort, you moved carriage. And I thought, my goodness, he's absolutely right. He says, so you know nothing about that individual. You're just looking at them. You're making a decision with your eyes. You're feeling uncomfortable just based on what your eyes are telling you. You know nothing about that person, but you move carriage. Yep, so that's unconscious bias. And it's a lot of what you're saying here is that we're doing that when we're watching video, but in a way when we're listening, we're not making those unconscious biases are not informing our decisions in quite such the same way.
Not as many, but I think there's still some unconscious biases, right? Accents,
yeah, okay, fair point.
We have always found with our clients that accents do really well, right? So I know I've got the accent, you don't. But in the States, somebody listens to you and you ask them which person, Lee or Tom, is more interesting, more educated. They will pick you because you sound different, right? So there's still some bias in there. And I think if you took all that out and just had the robots doing the voices, now it's getting creepy, right? But there is some bias in there, but we want, sometimes it can be positive bias too.
So what advice might you give businesses who are ready to turn the ship around, Tom, and start focusing on those meaningful conversations?
Yeah, I would just challenge, are the people that are telling us to buy the tactics, right? Are they just the ones selling the new tactics? The people that are telling us all to break through the noise, are they the ones that are just selling us the megaphones, right? Is it working? Or do you know in your heart that there's got to be something different, right? If you know in your heart that it's not working, well, look for something different. Look for a new marketing channel. And often I talk to clients and say, well, how do you get your best business? Oh, referrals. Well, find a way to get more referrals, right? And that doesn't mean going to more Chamber of Commerce events. It means getting out there, getting heard on other people's platforms. And one of the things that a lot of people will say is that there's that pushback. There's the imposter syndrome, right? Well, I'm not an expert. Well, we all have expertise in something, right? And this podcast, Extrology, right? We're all excellent. We're all extraordinary at something. And you've got wisdom, you've got brilliance that you can share with the world. And, I used to say, well, I can't share my ideas with the world. I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Well, now with technology and stuff like that, it's easier than ever. So other people say, I don't like the sound of my voice. Well, good. You don't have to listen to yourself. I encourage you to listen to your own interviews to get better, but other people have to listen to you. So, just get out there. I believe we're blessed to be a blessing, and what could help so many people, and encourage you to find a way to do that.
I think as an aside, and to reinforce your point around not liking, and there were many that will argue this against what I'm just about to say. I was going to say, I don't like the sound of my own voice. There will be many that will dispute that. But nonetheless, if I could give one word of encouragement to those businesses that are considering getting into great conversation, meaningful conversations with this sort of platform, it's just we don't sound what we think we sound like in our own heads. As I'm talking to you here, is not how we sound to other people. That's another thing that struck me is I listen to myself back, to your point, because you want to improve, and I don't sound like that. That's not my voice. That's not me. It's entirely me. It's how other people experience me. It's just not how I internally experience it myself. So I think, yeah, for those that might be considering it but are scared to take the leap for those reasons, absolutely take the leap. And I want to talk about your book, Tom. The title, first and foremost, One Conversation Away. Where did that stem from? Where did the inspiration come from?
That comes from my reaction to the marketing phrase "one funnel away." Right? There's, in the States, at least in digital marketing, everything is one funnel away. You're just one funnel away. And guess what they're selling? They're selling funnels, right? And, I'm all for automation, right? There's a part for it, but funnels don't fix everything. And I look at that and say, the people that have the funnels that work, it starts with the conversation to get them in there. And I think it's sort of my manifesto of what has worked in my business and in what's worked in my life is those conversations, the powerful conversations, the accidental conversations at times, sometimes even those awkward conversations. And today, in the digital world, I think too often we think we're communicating, right? Because I sent an email or I worked so hard all day on setting this thing up, Well, did you have any conversations with customers? Well, no, but I set this entire thing up. So you're telling me nobody heard you, right? So the idea of reminding myself, and often when I say things to other people, it's just a reminder to myself that the best things in my life have come through conversations. And, if I want to grow a rich life, a profitable business, it's going to come through more conversations.
So what was there a point at which you thought there's a book in there? I've got a book. I've often talked to people who perhaps have felt there's a book in there somewhere. I've often made bold boasts about there's a book in here somewhere. I don't know that there is. I certainly haven't taken the steps to actually go out and publish one. So was there a moment at which you thought, right, there is a book and I'm going to make it happen?
I would say it's from friends where I'd be talking about something and they're like, oh, that's the next chapter. I'm like, what? In your book, right? You keep talking about the same things. And I had a couple of friends that swore that they were going to start buying me pints and recording everything I said and then cleaning it up, right? So it sounded like it was an English speaker and published the book. So really, it's just the thoughts that I've had. It's probably a compilation of the conversations that I've had with people over the last 5 to 10 years and boiling down my thoughts into that.
So what's the journey for anybody out there who thinks I've got a book in me? How do you get started? How did you get started?
Getting started is not necessarily the hard part, right? Everybody started a book. They've started a novel. Whether or not it's written down or not, it's in their mind, right? I think the big part is getting it out of your mind and into paper, right? It's not going to help anybody when it's in your mind. And there was a gentleman by the name of Pat Flynn. He's got a great podcast called Smart Passive Income. And he really helped me with this, right? He's got a system where he says, you already know what these things are, right? And his idea is outline the chapters with Post-it notes. And so you want to talk about, awkward conversations. Well, what are you going to talk about in there? Why they're important, how to do them, all the rest of this, and come up with all the ideas on Post-it notes. And then on the wall behind me, I take, okay, this is the chapter I'm thinking about right now. And I'd put up all those Post-it notes in order, right? I'd move them around on things. And then I'd take my phone and hit record, and I would just start talking through that chapter. That was the draft, right? Then I could take that draft, I could clean that up, I could have other people read it, give me feedback on it. But that was the easiest way for me as an engineer, as a non-writer, to get it out of my mind and into a format that other people could actually start giving feedback on.
What do you think you'd gotten out of the process as the author? What has it given you?
To me, it's clarity, right? I've got ideas floating around in my mind, and writing, I'll mess this up, is the important part of thinking. There's Some people have talked about that. There's thinking and then there's writing, and that really solidifies it. And it helps me slow down enough in order to put those ideas in order and have thought through them. I remember years ago, Michael Stelzner runs a great conference in California called Social Media. A Social Media Marketing World is a conference. And I asked him one time, what's it take to get on your stage and speak? And he said, well, you got to have two of these three things. You either have written a book, you've got a huge following, or you're a celebrity. And I'm like, two of the three, huh? Well, I don't really have a huge, I've got sort of a following, right? But I'm not a celebrity, right? And I'm like, well, why is this the other two? He says, well, because if I have a celebrity with huge following, they come, they can talk about anything. They're going to bring people to the meeting.
Other people's platforms, right?
Other people's platforms, exactly. And
or other people's audience.
He's using the guests to bring that. But he's like, if someone has written a book on it, they've thought through it. They can communicate it from the stage, right? It's already boiled down from their brain into 150 pages. And he says that will bring value, and that will bring value to the people that are there.
So where can listeners find you? And equally as importantly, your books online?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. And this is a little where I pull behind the curtain. This is how you use podcast interview marketing. The best case is to always send people to one place, right? You're busy, you're driving, you're working out, all the rest of that. So send them to one place. And so it's interviewvalet with a V.com/extrology, right? And on there, there's an assessment, right? 10 questions. Will podcast interview marketing work for you? I'll put free copies of my book there. You can buy them on Amazon, but I'm happy to send you a free copy. Physical copy if you're in the States, digital copy if you're outside the States. And then, if you want to connect with me, I'll put my calendar there. I'll put my social media so you don't have to figure out which Tom Schwab in Kalamazoo, Michigan I am. So all of that will be there at interviewvalet.com/extrology.
Tom, thank you. That's been wonderful. And you've enabled all of us, I think, today to go behind the curtain of podcasting. I think we all recognize the media, but actually to really reflect and understand why and what it is about podcasting that can affect us positively, not only from a personal perspective, but arguably clearly from a business perspective. The value add that it can attribute is really thought-provoking and thoroughly insightful. And I've learned a lot. I'm taking away a lot here selfishly today. I know listeners will do too. So really appreciate you taking the time out. And it's been a pleasure to have you on as our guest.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate all you do.
Great stuff. Have a great day, Tom. Thanks again. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.